There is a moment in elite sports that no highlight reel ever truly captures. It is not the moment of victory. It is not the moment of celebration. And it is not even the moment of failure itself. It is the moment just before everything changes. When an athlete, standing at the highest level of competition, begins to lose control without even realizing it. At this level, every movement has been trained. Every reaction has been repeated thousands of times. Every decision has been refined under pressure so many times that it becomes automatic. And yet, despite all of that preparation, something still breaks. Not because the athlete is untrained, not because they are unprepared, but because pressure does something far more subtle than physical fatigue ever could. It changes how the brain processes reality in real time. What was once simple becomes complex. What was once automatic becomes uncertain. What was once controlled becomes unstable. And the most dangerous part is this. The athlete often does not realize it is happening until the moment is already gone. From the outside, everything still looks normal. The movements still appear coordinated. The body still responds. The structure of performance still holds. But internally, a different process has already started. The brain begins prioritizing survival over precision. The nervous system begins reacting faster than it can process. And decision-making shifts from controlled execution to instinct under stress. This is where elite performance begins to collapse. Not in physical ability, but in mental processing under.
What follows the turning point is often misunderstood, especially by those watching from the outside. From a distance, it can look simple. A mistake happens, the moment passes, the competition continues, and for many viewers, that is where the story ends. But for the athlete inside that moment, the outcome is not defined by the mistake alone. It is defined by what happens immediately after, in the seconds, minutes, and internal reactions that unfold once control has been disrupted. Because in elite performance, losing control is not just about the physical action that failed. It is about the system that supported that action suddenly becoming unstable. And once that stability is compromised, everything that follows begins to change. At first, the response is subtle. The athlete attempts to continue. There is an instinctive effort to regain rhythm, to reestablish control, to return to the state that existed just moments before the disruption occurred. This reaction is automatic. It is trained. Athletes are conditioned to recover quickly, to push forward, to avoid dwelling on errors. But what makes this moment complex is that recovery is no longer purely physical. The disruption has already reached the mental layer of performance. And once that happens, the system is no longer operating under the same conditions. The athlete may still be moving, still executing, still competing, but internally, something has shifted. Confidence, which was previously stable, now becomes fragile. Not completely lost, but altered. Instead of full trust in execution, there is now a slight hesitation.
A subtle awareness that something has already gone wrong. And that awareness introduces doubt. Not necessarily conscious doubt, but a background signal that affects decision-making. Movements that were once automatic now require confirmation. Actions that were previously instinctive now pass through an additional layer of mental processing. And that extra layer slows everything down. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Because at the highest level of performance, even the smallest delay can change the outcome of what happens next. As the athlete continues, the body attempts to maintain physical output. Muscles still respond. Coordination still exists. The structure of performance is still intact. But the connection between mind and body is no longer as seamless as it was before. This is where the true outcome begins to take shape. It is not in the visible mistake. It is in the invisible shift in processing that follows it. The athlete is now operating in what can be described as a compromised performance state. This state is not total failure. It is partial disruption. And partial disruption is often more dangerous than complete breakdown, because it creates the illusion that recovery is still fully possible within the same moment. The athlete believes they can return to previous rhythm immediately, but the system does not reset that quickly. Instead, it carries the imprint of the disruption forward. Every subsequent action is now influenced by what just happened. There is a slight increase in caution, a subtle tightening of movement, a reduced willingness to fully commit to execution. And this is where performance begins to change in a way that is difficult to detect externally, but significant internally. The athlete
is no longer performing freely. They're performing carefully. And careful performance is fundamentally different from confident performance. Confidence allows for fluidity. Caution introduces rigidity. Fluidity allows timing to remain natural. Rigidity interferes with timing. So even though the athlete is still competing, still active, still present in the moment, the quality of performance has shifted. This shift may not result in immediate additional mistakes, but it reduces the margin for error significantly, because the system is no longer operating at full efficiency. At the same time, the psychological weight of the mistake continues to develop. The brain begins to replay the moment, even while performance is ongoing, not as a clear, conscious replay, but as a background interference. A question forms. What went wrong? And while that question may not be fully articulated, it affects focus. Attention becomes divided. Part of the mind is still engaged in the present action. Another part is analyzing the past moment. And that division of attention is critical, because elite performance requires complete presence. Once attention is split, reaction speed drops further. Decision-making becomes less precise, and the risk of additional errors increases. This is why the outcome of a single mistake is rarely limited to that moment alone. It creates a chain reaction, not always visible, but always influential. As time continues, the athlete attempts to stabilize. Breathing patterns may adjust. Movement may slow slightly to regain control. There may be an effort to simplify actions, to reduce complexity, to operate within a safer range of execution. And in some cases, this strategy works. The athlete regains partial control. The system stabilizes enough to continue without further major disruption. But even in these cases, the performance is no longer at its peak level. It is now a managed performance, not a natural one. And the difference between those two states is
significant. A natural performance allows the athlete to operate at full capacity. A managed performance focuses on avoiding further mistakes rather than maximizing output. This shift changes the entire dynamic of competition. Instead of pushing forward, the athlete begins holding back. Instead of expanding performance, they begin containing it. And while this may prevent immediate collapse, it also limits potential. In other cases, the outcome is more severe. The initial mistake leads to further disruption. The system struggles to stabilize. Confidence continues to drop, and performance begins to degrade more visibly. Movements become less precise. Timing becomes inconsistent. Decision-making becomes reactive instead of proactive. At this stage, the athlete is no longer controlling the situation. They are responding to it. And response-based performance is inherently less stable than control-based performance, because it depends on external events rather than internal readiness. The longer this state continues, the more difficult recovery becomes, because each additional moment reinforces the disruption. Each additional mistake increases pressure. Each increase in pressure accelerates cognitive overload, and the system moves further away from its original state of balance. Eventually, the outcome becomes clear.
Whether the athlete stabilizes partially or continues to decline, the performance is no longer what it was intended to be. The result of the competition is affected, but more importantly, the internal experience of the athlete is changed. Because what they have encountered is not just a mistake, it is a loss of control under pressure. And that experience leaves an imprint. After the moment passes,
After the performance ends, after the external evaluation is complete, the internal analysis begins. The athlete reflects, not just on the mistake, but on the feeling of losing control. On the moment where execution no longer matched intention. On the realization that something within the system did not respond as expected. This reflection is critical because it shapes future performance. If understood correctly, it becomes a learning point, a recognition of limits, an awareness of how pressure affects processing, a deeper understanding of the balance between control and overload. But if misunderstood, it becomes a source of doubt, a memory that resurfaces in future high-pressure situations, a hesitation that appears before critical decisions, a subtle reduction in confidence that affects performance long after the original moment has passed. This is why the outcome of such incidents extends far beyond the visible event. It is not just about what happened in that moment. It is about how that moment changes the system moving forward. Because in elite sports, performance is not built only on physical ability. It is built on trust. Trust in the body. Trust in the process. Trust in execution under pressure. And once that trust is disrupted, even slightly, rebuilding it requires more than training. It requires understanding. It requires adjustment. It requires awareness of how close the system came to its limit. In the end, the outcome is not simply a mistake in performance. It is a shift in perception. A moment that reveals the gap between control and breakdown. What this moment ultimately reveals is something far more important than the mistake itself. Because when people watch situations like this from the outside, the focus is almost always on what went wrong, the error, the miscalculation, the visible breakdown that changed the outcome. But that perspective, while understandable, only captures the surface of what actually happened. The real story exists beneath the action, in the process that led to that moment. And more importantly, in the way pressure reshapes how even the most trained athletes think, react, and perform in real time. At the highest level of sport, ability is rarely the issue. These athletes have already proven that they possess the skill, the discipline, and the physical capacity required to perform under demanding conditions. They have trained for years, repeated movements thousands of times, refined their reactions until they become automatic. So when a breakdown happens, it is not because the athlete suddenly forgot how to perform. It is because something interfered with how that performance was accessed in that specific moment. And that something is almost always pressure. But pressure, in this context, is often misunderstood. It is not simply the presence of a crowd. It is not just the importance of the event. And it is not only about external expectations. Pressure is internal. It is created when the brain begins to perceive that the outcome of a situation carries significant consequence, while at the same time demanding near-perfect execution. That combination changes how the mind operates. Under normal conditions, elite athletes rely on automatic processing. This is what allows them to perform quickly, efficiently, and without hesitation.
It is the result of years of repetition and conditioning. But when pressure increases beyond a certain threshold, the brain shifts away from that automatic system. It begins to move toward conscious control. And while that may seem like a positive adjustment, it actually creates a problem. Because conscious control is slower. It requires more mental energy. It introduces doubt. And most importantly, it interrupts flow. Flow is what allows elite performance to feel effortless. It is the state where the athlete is not thinking about each action, but simply executing based on instinct and training. Once flow is disrupted, everything becomes harder. Movements feel less natural. Decisions take longer. Confidence becomes unstable. And even though the athlete is still capable, their ability to access that capability becomes limited. This is why pressure does not eliminate skill. It distorts it. The athlete still has the ability to perform at a high level, but the pathway to that performance is no longer clear. It becomes crowded with hesitation, second-guessing, and increased mental load. And this is where the real breakdown begins. Not in the body, but in the connection between thought and action. Because in elite sports, timing is everything. And timing is directly affected by mental processing. Even a slight delay in decision-making can change the outcome of an action. A fraction of a second hesitation can turn a controlled movement into an unstable one. A moment of doubt can interfere with execution that would otherwise be automatic. These are not large, obvious errors. They are small disruptions. But at the highest level, small disruptions create significant consequences. And what makes this even more complex is that the athlete is often aware of these changes while they are happening. Not fully aware, but enough to feel that something is different. Enough to sense that performance is no longer flowing the same way. And that awareness introduces another layer of pressure. Because now, the athlete is not only dealing with the external situation, they are also dealing with their own internal response to it. They are trying to correct, adjust, and regain control, all while still performing. And that creates overload. Too many things are being processed at once. Too many variables are competing for attention. And the system begins to lose efficiency. This is why breakdowns often appear sudden from the outside, because the visible moment is only the final stage of a much longer internal process. A process that involves gradual shifts in focus, confidence, and cognitive load. A process that builds quietly, without obvious
warning signs, until it reaches a point where the system can no longer maintain balance. And once that point is reached, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. But this is where the most important lesson emerges. Because while pressure can distort performance, it can also be managed. Not eliminated completely, but understood and controlled. The key lies in how athletes are trained to respond to pressure, not just physically, but mentally. Because physical preparation alone is not enough at the highest level. An athlete can be in peak physical condition and still experience breakdown if the mental system is overloaded. This is why mental conditioning is critical. Learning how to maintain focus under stress. Learning how to trust automatic execution even when pressure increases. Learning how to recognize early signs of cognitive overload before they turn into visible mistakes. These are skills that are just as important as strength, speed, and technique. And yet, they are often overlooked. Because they are not as visible. They do not show up in training statistics or performance metrics. But they determine how performance holds up when conditions become extreme. Another important takeaway from this moment is the role of awareness. Not awareness in the sense of overthinking, but awareness of internal state. Understanding when the body is beginning to fatigue. Recognizing when the mind is becoming overloaded.
identifying when execution is shifting from automatic to controlled. These signals are subtle, but they are present. And the athletes who learn to recognize them early are the ones who are able to adjust before breakdown occurs.
Because once the system crosses a certain threshold, recovery becomes much more difficult within the same moment. At that point, the focus shifts from prevention to damage control. And while damage control can stabilize the situation, it rarely restores peak performance immediately. So the real advantage comes from preventing the breakdown before it happens, from maintaining balance rather than trying to rebuild it after it is lost. In any high-pressure situation, whether it is business, decision-making, leadership, or personal challenges, the mind and body operate under similar rules. Pressure increases cognitive load. Cognitive load affects decision-making. Decision-making influences outcomes. And the ability to maintain clarity under pressure becomes the defining factor between control and breakdown. So in many ways, this is not just a story about sports. It is a reflection of human behavior under stress, a demonstration of how even the most prepared individuals can experience disruption when internal systems are pushed beyond their limit. But it is also a reminder of something equally important, that performance is not just about pushing harder. It is about understanding how to operate effectively within limits. It is about knowing when to trust instinct, when to simplify, when to reduce mental load instead of increasing it. Because at the highest level, success is not only defined by how much pressure an individual can handle,
by how well they can maintain control while experiencing it. And in that sense, the real lesson is not about avoiding pressure. It is about mastering the response to it. Because pressure will always exist, but control is something that must be maintained. And this brings us to a final, deeper realization. Because what this moment shows is not just how athletes fail under pressure. It shows how human performance works at its core. The same principles apply beyond sports.